For your corset, you're going to want an exterior fashion fabric. This is going to be on the outside of your corset. I'm just using a quilter's weight cotton, but there are a lot of fantastic options you could use for this. You don't want anything super lightweight or silky, because it does need to have a little bit of body and shape. For the inside of the corset, you're going to want a support weight fabric. I'm using canvas here, but the best fabric that you can use is coutil. However, coutil is a little expensive and harder to find, so I'm using my budget-friendly fabrics today. But coutil is definitely the best if you're looking to make a high-quality corset. You can also use a nice denim. What you want to look for is fabrics that are tightly woven, because you don't want any of the boning to poke through the fabric. Depending on your fashion fabric, you may also want some interfacing. Since I'm going to create my boning channels by simply sandwiching them in between these two layers, I do want to make sure they're quite sturdy. So for my fashion fabric, I'm going to add some interfacing. This is just a woven interfacing. It's Pellon's SF101, which I'm going to use on the back of my fashion fabric, but that is optional. You'll also want grommets with washers. These are a little bit sturdier than eyelets and will help support the structure of the corset. The number you'll need will vary depending on how closely they're placed on your corset. You're also going to want boning. The best option is synthetic whalebone. For this corset, I'm going to be using straight boning channels so that we can use plastic boning, which is usually pretty easy to find and affordable. I'm going to be using 1/4 inch wide zip ties for my project because they're affordable and easy to find. You're also going to want lacing for your corset, such as ribbon or rattail cord or corset lacing. For tools, you may want a cutter to cut your boning. These are pet nail trimmers, which actually work really great at cutting the zip ties, which was recommended by American Duchess, and I find that they work really well. You're also going to want your basic sewing supplies as well as rulers and fabric marking tools. As you start your project, I really recommend making a tester or a twill. This is just a single layer of canvas fabric that I sewed together to see how the pattern worked. I just folded over the back edge and used some eyelets, but it did allow me to get a good idea for the fit of the pattern and make some minor adjustments before I used my fashion fabric. It also helped me determine where I wanted to place my boning. Making a tester for your corset does take a bit of extra time, but it's really a benefit in the overall quality and fit of your final project to know that your pattern is really going to work. It'd be wonderful if we all fit exactly the same patterns, but for corsets, they're often very specific to a given body type. And since most of us aren't proportioned like a dress form, it's always good to test and make adjustments beforehand. So if you have the time and resources, I would recommend making a tester of the project to ensure that it fits first. I find when I do so, I'm usually more satisfied with the final project. I'm making an underbust corset today, and here's my pattern. I drafted this pattern using the book Making Corsets by Julie Collins Brealey, and I found it to be really successful. So I highly recommend this book if you're looking to get started in making corsets. For my corset today, I'm going to be doing a corset with a closed front, so that means there will not be a busk in the center. So I'm going to select the front panel piece that is joined. If you have a pattern that has a seam down the front and you don't want one, you can just put the center front line in the middle and then mirror the pattern piece. Similarly, for the back piece of the pattern, I am using the back piece that has the seam allowance attached. You do not need the fold over facing. You'll only want the fold over facing if you are making the tester. That way, if you're making your tester pattern, you can fold the back edge over to give yourself a little extra strength when you're doing the eyelets. So for the actual corset, I don't use the fold over facing. For the actual corset, I just use the back piece with a regular seam allowance. I have included this pattern on my website as well as a couple other sizes. However, they are quite limited at present, but I will try to upload more sizes as I have time. So I apologize for not having a wider range of sizes to start. Once you have your pattern, it's time to cut out your fabric. I'm ready to start cutting out my pieces, and one thing I've done in advance is fuse my interfacing to the back of my fashion fabric. I like to do it in advance because it saves a little bit of cutting, but if you prefer, you can cut out all the pieces individually and then fuse them together when you're done cutting. One thing that is nice to do before you begin is to lay out all of your pattern pieces so that you can see exactly how much fabric you're going to need. For my size, it worked if I had one layer from selvage to selvage and then another half panel from that same cut of fabric. So basically it's the 42 inches across and then another 21, and then I have a little bit extra that I can use for my binding. If you have a smaller or larger size than mine, your fabric quantity needed may vary, as well as the amount of interfacing needed. I'm only interfacing the pieces where the actual corset pieces will be, and I don't want to waste it on the binding, so this section I did not interface. I have my pattern ready to go, and I'm going to start cutting out the pieces. If you're using a printed fabric, you may want to do what's called fussy cutting your fabric. That means to strategically place your pieces on the fabric so that the print is where you want it to be. I have unfortunately not been careful about this before and ended up with a corset that looked kind of off balance because I wasn't careful about the print. So you may want to think about that if you want it symmetric or something like that. When I cut out pieces for my corset, I like to cut in a single layer because it is very important to be precise. With corsets, there are so many seams and so many pieces being sewn together that if your seam allowance or your cutting is off just slightly, it can make a huge difference in the size of your corset. I have my center front piece positioned, and now I'm going to lay out the others. I am going to try and keep mine symmetric on the fabric. And I'm also going to take care to make sure that the arrows on my pattern are going the same direction as the grain line. The grain line is very important on corset patterns to make sure that it drapes correctly. I can see that my pattern fits, and it looks like I might actually have a little extra today, although it may not have if I had a wider center front. I'm going to make sure that my pattern does not touch the selvage, and I'm ready to go ahead and cut out. When you cut out your pieces, you can use weights and cut around the edges. You can use pins and then cut around. Personally, I like to trace the pattern pieces, and that's just a personal preference, but you can use whichever method is most comfortable for you. Whichever technique you use, do take care to be precise, so you do want to be exact. Also, you'll notice that my pattern has these little triangles that show where the different pieces align together. Those are significant. For my pattern, I'm going to be relying more heavily on those markings than the edges of the pieces to show where to match them together. So this is something that you don't want to skip over. Also, I like to have these arrows pointing outward like a little mountain on the edge of the fabric. And there are a couple reasons for that. One is it will keep the seam allowance of the fabric a little bit stronger, and it will prevent accidental holes for making clips or notches too big. So I'm going to go ahead and get started on the center front and trace this pattern piece. I'm using just a ballpoint pen so that you can see it today, but normally I'll just use a mechanical pencil. Whatever you choose, you do want it to be pretty precise. The more accurate, the better. Since I'm drawing my line on the outside of my pattern piece, when I cut it, I'm going to cut on the inside of my drawn line. So I'll basically be cutting the line off so that you won't see it later. I'm also going to mark key locations on my pattern at this time. I'm going to mark the center front. I'm also going to mark the top and bottom of the boning casings. So you can see my traced pattern. I'm going to go ahead and mark my center front line. For the fashion fabric, the boning channels are not essential to draw on this section. However, it is essential on the lining. So I'm going to do it on this piece just so that you can see, but I'm not going to draw the boning channels on the rest of my fashion fabric. I'm only going to draw it on my strength layer. So for the boning channels, I'm just going to match each mark on the top with each mark on the bottom. I now have my piece all traced and my markings transferred. So I have all of my notches as well as my center front line and my boning lines. The last thing that I'm going to want when I trace my pattern piece is I actually want to mark the top. It sounds kind of silly, but in some corset patterns, it's really not easy to tell. And I also like to mark which piece it is so I don't forget. And I usually put these markings in the seam allowance. So on the seam allowance here, I'm going to put a little F to remind myself that this is my front piece. And then along the top edge, I'm going to put a little T to show that this is the top. That way I won't forget where the top edge is and I know that this is the front piece. And then I'm ready to cut this one out. My front piece is ready to go. It's precisely cut with my notches present and all of my important markings transferred. It's also labeled with the top edge and what piece it is. When you lay out your pieces on your fabric, one thing you want to check is to make sure that the matching points are side by side. So for example, you can see with these two pieces here, they have a single notch. These are the two sides that will be touching when the pattern pieces are cut. So if I want to lay out my corset on the fabric in the same manner in which it's going to be constructed, look for those match points. So you can see with my pattern, these two sides will align, these two. So keep an eye on those watch points. Those are other indicators to make sure that your pieces are assembled in the correct direction. It may also help you keep your fabric print symmetric if that's important to you. One reminder when cutting out your pieces, I've cut the front piece of my corset and I'm ready to cut the others. And so I've cut one side using my pattern pieces and those are all ready to go. Now I have to cut the other side. Now, because I did not fold my fabric, because it was not in a double layer when I did this, when I cut the other side, I have to make sure it's a mirror image. I don't want two left sides of my corset or two right sides of my corset. I need a left and a right. That means when I cut my pieces, I need one and one reversed. So I've cut all of these pattern pieces with the pattern facing right side up. When I do the next set for the other side, I'm gonna have my pattern pieces facing right side down. So here's my center front piece. The side front needs to adjoin it, and the side that needs to be facing the center front is the one with the two notches. So when I select my side front piece, you can see that the two notches are here. If I set my pattern piece on my fabric like this, it doesn't match up. The pieces I need are not side by side. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna flip my pattern piece over. You can see where I've marked my triangles with pen, and that's a good idea to do before you start cutting. And now you can see I have the two edges that are going to align side by side, which is what I want. So when I lay out all of my other pieces, they are also going to be upside down. The printed side of the pattern is going to be facing the fabric. That way I'll end up with mirror images on my corset. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut the second side. Here's an interesting tip for cutting your pieces. If you've traced your pattern pieces onto your fabric and you want to make sure that you cut on just the inside of the line to make sure it's where the edge of your pattern was, one thing that does make a difference is if you're deciding to cut either clockwise or counterclockwise. Depending on if you're left or right-handed, this may change, but I'm right-handed, and I find if I go around the piece in a clockwise fashion, I can keep an eye on this line and cut just to the inside. So if I go this way, when I cut, I can see the line. Therefore, I can keep my scissors directly next to it, so I can see that I'm cutting off the line itself, and on my piece, I don't have the line. But you can see that it's incredibly close. When you cut the other direction, you can still do so, but when you're actually doing the cutting, you can't see where the line is because your scissors blocks it. And so just if you're looking for that extra little bit of precision and you want to make sure that you can totally keep an eye on that line, changing either clockwise or counterclockwise so that the line is visible as you're cutting can make a big difference. And obviously you'd want to cut flat on your table instead of holding it up high like I was for the camera. But keep it nice, keep it steady, and keep that line visible, and it will help add that little extra bit of exactness. I have all of my fashion fabric pieces cut out. Each piece has the notches attached and is labeled with the name of the piece and the top of the piece. I also have their mirror images. And my friends, this is why you lay out your pieces before you start cutting your project. I wasted this whole section of fabric because I didn't realize that this fabric was a little wider than what I had used in the past. And so this whole part wasn't necessary. So I could have saved myself a lot of interfacing if I had just laid out my pieces in advance. So just something to keep an eye on whenever you begin a project before you start cutting or fusing interfacing. Lay out your pieces, make sure it fits on your fabric so that you don't have as much waste. Not only does it save you some money and materials, it also saves you a good bit of time. I'm now ready to start cutting my canvas pieces. This is my support layer, which should be coutil, canvas, denim, something that's a good weight. For this, I'm going to do exactly the same as the other pieces. I'm going to trace around the edge. I'm going to have my triangle markings here. I'm also going to make sure that I mark the center front as well as the boning channels on all of my pieces. I'm using a Sharpie so that you can see it on camera. I wouldn't necessarily do that on a regular corset because these marks will be seen. So something that can vanish is nice. I am still going to label which piece is which, so I'm going to label this as front and top, and I'm going to be really careful to make sure that my marks are in my seam allowance. Since I am using Sharpie, anything I write you will see on the inside of the corset, and so I want to make sure you don't see those when I'm done. So I've just got a little T for top, F for front, so I remember which piece this is. And again, on every single piece, I'm going to draw my boning channels. But the rest of the process is exactly the same as what we did for the fashion fabric. I have cut out all the canvas pieces for both sides and the center front, and you'll notice that these pieces do have the boning channels marked. On my canvas pieces, I'm going to use the markings as a reference when I sew. So on these pieces, the sides that have the markings are my right side, where on the fashion fabric, the sides that have the markings are the wrong side. So you'll want to keep that in mind when you sew. I'm ready to begin sewing the first side of my corset. I'm going to start with my fashion fabric. When I sew my corset together, I like to have all the pieces laid out in the order that they're going to go. Usually one of the most common mistakes when making a corset is mixing up the pieces, putting one upside down, having it be in the wrong place. And I find if I lay it all out the way it's supposed to be, I'm less likely to make a mistake. It helps me keep all of my pieces organized and oriented in the correct position. So I have them all laid out with the top edge up at the top, bottom edge at the bottom, and the matching sides side by side. So now I'm ready to start sewing, and I'm going to begin by sewing the front piece to the side front. So I'm going to take the side front piece and lay it on top of the front with right sides touching. And let's take a closer look at this. When I align these pieces, I'm going to focus on aligning the notches rather than the edges of the fabric. And there's a couple reasons for that. The first reason is that it's really important to align the waistline on the corset, and these little notches here correspond to the waistline. The next is if there is any discrepancy in the top or bottom of my corset, I can always just trim that off at the end, so I'm not super concerned about it. So rather than being really careful at the edges of my corset, I'm going to take extra care at the center. So I'm going to align these notches here at the waist. I'm going to make sure they align as well as the raw edges of the fabric here, and I'm going to pin it in place. And then I'm going to take the top edge and align those raw edges and make sure this notch matches up. You can see that the top edge is off just a smidge, and it's probably just an error in my cutting, but that is something I can address later. And now I'm going to head to the sewing machine and sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And you do want to be as precise as possible. Remember, any error in your seam allowance will be amplified across the corset, so you do want to take care to be really precise. Now that my side seam is done, I'm going to check it to make sure everything looks okay. And if not, I'm going to make adjustments. And then I'm going to head back to my table. So now the front and side front pieces are connected, and I'm ready to add the side. So as before, I'm going to take the side piece, place it right side down on top, align the waist notches, and pin in place. And now I'm going to sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then I'm going to repeat the process for the other pieces until this whole side is connected. And repeat the process for the other half. All of the fashion fabric pieces are now connected. I'm going to do the exact same thing for my support layer, and I'm going to continue to be just as precise because the two will need to match up when I'm done. And as you sew your support layer, remember the side with the markings is your right side. I now have the pieces assembled for both the fashion fabric and the strength layer. What you may want to do now is double check to make sure that these line up. So if you place these right sides together, and you take a look at your top edges as well as your bottom edges, the seam allowances should line up. If they don't line up, then now is a good time to make adjustments. Once you've ensured that your two panels align correctly, now it's time to press the seams. There are two different techniques you can use when pressing your seams. For the first technique, you press your seam flat to set the stitches, and then you press the seam in one direction. On the strength layer, I always like to press the seam allowance towards the center back. So this side will go this direction and this side will go this direction. And then when I press on my fashion fabric, I'm gonna do the opposite. I'll press each seam flat and then I'll press each seam towards the center. So these seams will go this way and these seams this way. That way the bulk will be staggered when we put the two together. The second option for pressing your seams is to simply press the seam flat to set the stitches and then press the seam open and do the same on the fashion fabric. Whichever technique you choose to use, it's often helpful to use a pressing ham since the corset is not designed to lay flat but to curve around the figure. It does usually press nicer when you have a pressing ham. I also find that I often have to press the bottom and then the top in separate sections because of this angle here. I'm going to trim off my tab to remove the bulk. I no longer need it since my pieces are already aligned. I'm going to try both pressing techniques on my corset and then I'll let you know which one I like best. I'm going to continue this process for all the seams. This half of the corset was constructed by pressing the seams to opposite directions. I found that using this technique made it easy to align the seams in the beginning. So when I was putting the structure layer and the fashion layer together, aligning the seams was quite simple. The two seams nested together quite easily. It made aligning the panels really nice. However, after the corset was constructed, I found that these seams tend to want to separate just a little bit more. They feel a little more bulky and they tend to want to puff up just a little bit. This probably won't be noticeable when you're actually wearing the corset because it is going to be pulled snug. However, I found that this technique benefited greatly from stitching in the ditch along the edge just to help keep those two sections together just a little bit more firmly. So if I use this technique in the future, I would definitely stitch in the ditch along my seams. And that could be beneficial, especially if you want to add more boning channels along your seam line. The other half of the corset was constructed with the seam allowances both pressed open. I found that using this technique was a little bit harder when you were aligning your panels. Aligning the structure layer and the foundation layer together, they wanted to shift a little bit. There wasn't a nice resting place for them to meet together, and so you had to be really particular when you were aligning those sections. However, once the corset was actually constructed and put together, these seams laid really flat. So the seams on this side are not stitched in the ditch, but they feel really smooth and they don't tend to want to pop up. So these seem to lay a little flatter after constructed. It would benefit from stitching in the ditch just because more contact points would keep it together better. However, it doesn't seem as essential as it did on the other side of the corset. So my personal preference would be to press them open, but if you're more concerned with getting your corset to line up in the beginning, the other technique may be better for you. So you can kind of identify your own skills and needs, and based on that, choose the method that you think would be most valuable to you. But in the end, both techniques produced a beautiful seam and can work well on your corset. Both layers of the corset have been pressed, and now I'm ready to put the two together. Aligning the top edges and the seam allowances, place the fashion fabric and your structure layer right sides together. If you've pressed your seams open, align those seams just precisely. If you have pressed your seams from side to side, they kind of nest together with the seam in the middle, but either way, your seam should be lining up. Check across the whole corset to make sure everything aligns. You may want to check the bottom edge as well. Once you're sure that everything matches up, align the two side edges together. Make sure to keep this seam matched up. Do the same on the other side. The two side edges are pinned, and I'm going to sew them together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. The bottom and the top are going to be left loose for now, so I'm only sewing the two side edges. Press the seams flat and trim off the notches and turn the corset right side out. Make sure it's fully extended. Make sure those stitches are right on the edge, and we're going to press that flat. Take the time to really check to make sure that that seam allowance is not tucked inside. You can use a corner turner to help you. And now I'm going to align all of the seams on the top and bottom edges. You do also want to take care to make sure the raw edges are lining up. Everything pinned together and matched up, and now I'm going to stitch along the bottom edge. I'm going to stitch with a seam allowance that is just a little bit smaller than 1/4 inch. Now I'm only going to stitch the bottom, not the top. We're going to leave the top open so that we can insert all of the boning. But I do want to stitch the bottom together, 1, because it will help it stay in place, and 2, that way I can get rid of some of these pins. But I do want to keep my seam allowance small because I don't actually want to see these stitches on my finished corset. That part's done, and the next thing I'm going to do is create my boning channels. For this, I'm actually going to turn to the inside of my corset, so I'm looking at the structure layer, and I'm going to stitch on all of my boning lines. Also, since I do not have a busk in this corset, I'm going to add some boning to the center front, and I want 2 boning channels. So I'm going to grab my ruler, and I'm going to draw a line 3/8 inch away from center front on each side. I'm also going to add some casing marks to the center back. The zip ties that I'm using at the center back of my corset are going to be a 1/2 inch wide, so they're a little bit stronger than a normal zip tie. Because of that, I'm going to draw my casing 5/8 of an inch away from the edge. So you usually want the casing about 1/8 of an inch larger than what your boning is. So my boning is 1/2 inch, so I'm going to draw a line 5/8. If your boning is not that large, you may need to adjust the size of the casing. So along the center back edge, I'm going to draw a line 5/8 of an inch from the center back. And then I'm going to leave a space for my grommets. And I'm going to leave another 1/2 inch to place my grommets. So I'm going to mark a 1/2 inch away from the line I just drew. And then I'm going to add another piece of boning on the other side. This is going to be a regular size zip tie, so it's a 1/4 inch wide. So I'm going to draw a casing 3/8 of an inch from that. So 5/8, 4/8, 3/8. And I'm going to do the same on the other center back edge. And now I'm going to go to the sewing machine and stitch all of these channels. I'm going to stitch directly on the line starting from bottom to top, and I'm going to take care to make sure my corset doesn't shift positions. As you sew, take care to smooth out the fabric and make sure that the section you're sewing is laying flat. I have all of my boning channels stitched on my corset, and before I place the boning in, I want to check to make sure that the edges are as I would like them. So at this point, you'll want to trim the bottom and top edge to be the way you'd like them in your final corset. Also, if your fabric is not strong enough to act as your boning casings, you can use separate casings. Simply attach the casings to the wrong side of your structure layer prior to putting the fashion fabric and your structure layer together. If you use that technique, you will need to make sure that your layers are secured together after joining the sides. To do that, you can do what's called stitching in the ditch. You can also do that on a corset like mine with the sandwich channels. To stitch in the ditch, you basically just do a row of stitching along your seam line. The stitches are meant to be invisible and sink into that seam so you don't actually see them on your final corset. My corset here probably doesn't really need them because there are enough casing stitches to really hold these together so they're not going to move. However, if you just want it to be a little bit more secure, if you want to make sure that these seam allowances are not going to move at all, or if you did use the separate casings, then stitching in the ditch is a really good idea. You want to do this from the front side of the fabric, and you are going to find your seam line, and you are going to stitch exactly in that line. Your needle will sink right into that section where that fabric is joined, so your stitches slide right in there. It is kind of tricky to do. It does take practice. You do have to go really slow, and it doesn't always go perfectly. You always want to do it from the right side because that's the side you're going to see. I've found if you do that, you can get pretty good at having it work just great on the front, but the back almost never works out perfectly. So always do it from the front side. You can also do this step by hand using just a needle and thread if you prefer, if it's not something you want to do on the sewing machine. So I'm not going to do that on my whole corset, but I will show you one seam just so you can see what it's like. Let's take a closer look at our stitch in the ditch. This is the seam that I stitched in the ditch here, and you notice that the stitches are practically invisible. However, when you look to the back side, you can see that my stitches did not sink into that ditch. It would require an extreme amount of precision in order to get it to be perfectly lined up. So you may want to do your stitching by hand if you want to make sure that it is exactly lining up on both the inside and outside of the corset. Hand sewing might be something I would choose if I was going to sell this corset to someone else, just because it would have a more professional finish. Now that all my boning channels are completed, I'm ready to cut the boning. You want to cut a piece of boning for each channel. You want the boning to come close to your bottom stitching, but at the top you have to leave a little bit of room for your seam allowance. I also like to leave just a little bit of ease so that I don't accidentally hit the boning when I'm sewing. So what I'm going to do when I cut my bones is align it with the bottom edge of the stitching here and then cut 1/2 inch from the top. I'm using zip ties since they are easy to work with. So the first thing I'm going to do is snip off this large end. And then I'm going to eliminate these pointy corners. I'm just going to snip off each little pointy end at an angle. We don't want this edge to be sharp because we don't want it poking through our fabric. And then I'm going to find the channel that I'm aligning this with. This is going to go in this channel here. So I'm going to align it just above that stitching line at the bottom. I'm going to mark 1/2 inch down from the top edge. And then I'm going to trim as before. I usually like to put all of the boning in as I go, but if you prefer not to, if you want to cut all your bones and then put them in at the end, you may also want to label which boning channel this goes in. So if you're starting at the center back, I've already done the second channel. This would be my third channel. So I would label this as the third bone on the right. And then when I go to put it in to my corset later, I'll know which one it is. Another step that is also helpful before inserting the boning into your corset is to sand the edges just a smidge. As I mentioned before, we don't want these sharp edges poking through our fabric. So if you just sand them a little, it usually doesn't take much, just a couple runs along the sandpaper, and you can eliminate all those sharp edges. I'll do the same on both ends. And now I'm going to place my boning in my corset. And I'm going to do that for all of the boning channels, including the large ones on the sides. This is a big 1/2 inch wide zip tie that I'm using for this channel here. And I picked these up on Amazon. Boning has been placed in all of the channels and my corset is now pretty sturdy. Next, I'm going to place the grommets on my corset, and I'm going to start by looking at the center back panel. So my grommets are going to go right between the two bones. The number of grommets that you choose is really up to you. You want to make sure that you start far enough away from the edge that your grommet is not going to be in the path of your binding, which will be about 1/4 inch wide. I've decided I'm going to use 6 grommets on my corset. They can be anywhere from 1 to 2 inches apart, depending on how you want to lace your corset. Since I want to make my grommets at least 1/2 inch away from the edge of the fabric, you can see that my corset is about 8 3/4 here, so I want to take off 1 inch. That would make it 7 3/4. And just to make my math easy, I'm going to round that to 7.5. So I'm actually going to start my grommets 5/8 from the edge. So I'm gonna mark 5/8 of an inch from the bottom edge and put a dot, and 5/8 of an inch from the top edge and put a dot. Notice my dots are centered in this panel. And then there's 7.5 inches between the two. If you'd like to use 6 grommets, in order to determine how far apart to place them, simply divide your length by 5. So if I take my measurement 7.5 and divide by 5, it gives me 1.5 inches. If I space my grommets 1.5 inches apart, I'll have 1 to start, and then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which is just what I wanted. So I now have the grommet placement marked on 1/2 of the corset. Now I'm going to repeat the exact same markings on the other section. Double check to make sure that your markings align on each side. Before inserting the grommets into your corset, it's usually a good idea to test them on some scrap fabric. It's best if you use scraps of the exact same fabric that you're going to be using for your corset. The fabric I have here is exactly the same type of fabric as the corset that I'm making, just different colors. You can see that I've sampled 3 different grommets here. These grommets are all technically the same size. The opening for all 3 is the same, but you can see that their widths and sturdiness is quite a bit different. There are lots of different methods and techniques that you could use to insert the grommets into your corset and to create the opening to place the grommet itself. And depending on your fabric, you may need a different technique. On this scrap fabric, I'm going to show you how I entered these grommets, and then I'll do so on my corset. First, I find the location that I want to put my grommet. For just practice here, it doesn't really matter. Using my mark as a guide, I'm going to take an awl and poke a hole. This is a really slender awl with a very sharp point. I find that it makes the hole just a little bit easier using one like this to start. Since the awl is very sharp, you never want to point it towards yourself or anyone else as you do this process. So I like to poke the awl through the opening, and then I'll make sure that my hands are behind the awl. And this does take some practice. And I'll slowly but steadily poke the awl through. This does take a good amount of arm muscle and pressure, but using an awl can help separate the threads rather than tear them. I now have an opening for my grommet. For some fabrics, this technique won't work. Some fabrics, when you try to poke the hole using an awl, will actually make a run in the fabric. You can see right here next to this grommet, I got a slight showing of that. You can just see the little run in the fabric. For the most part on mine, that doesn't happen. But if you notice in your testing that that occurs a lot on your fabric, and it would be much more noticeable on a solid color rather than a print, you may need to use a different technique. If you find that you can't poke the initial hole in your fabric using an awl, a lot of grommet die setters come with a cutter as well. So sometimes that will fit into your grommet press where you can actually use the press to cut the opening, or similarly use a hammer to cut the opening the size for the grommet intended. If you don't have that, I find this hardware tool works great to actually cut the hole in the fabric. You just want to be really careful to make sure that the hole is not larger than necessary. If you make the hole too large, your grommet could come loose and fall out. This takes some good hand muscle too. And I find sometimes I have to use my little precise scissors to finish cutting out the section. But that works as well if the awl isn't an option. But the awl is my first choice. Once you have your original opening, then what I like to do is take a larger tapered awl and insert it into the hole again. So this one is not as sharp at the point, so I don't like to use it for the initial opening, but it does gradually get wider at the bottom. This one is my favorite, and I find this one works just perfect for size 0 grommets. So after I have the original opening, then I'll poke this back in, and I extend the opening even larger using the larger awl. Again, this does take time and patience and some muscle. Make sure to keep yourself safe and take any safety precautions that you need to protect yourself as you do this. Now I have an opening that is really close in size to the diameter of the grommet. However, if I try to just insert the grommets like this, all the little threads tend to get in the way. So my favorite technique is to actually take the grommet and place it on the awl right side down. So you want the front side of the grommet facing towards where you're holding it, and then the little stem that you put the fabric on facing towards the point. And I'll slide this down. And then I take the fabric and place it on the awl. When I use this method, it keeps all the little fibers out of that opening, and I can use my fingernails to slide the fabric onto the stem of the grommet. It still takes a little playing, and if the fabric is too tight, then I'll take the grommet off and use the awl one more time to extend the opening. And I want to make sure that all those fabric fibers are down around the base of the grommet. The next step is optional, but I do like to take a little fabric sealant and place it around the edge of my fabric, just for a little added security. Then I'll take the washer and place it down on the grommet. And another good reason to practice is so that you can see the correct direction of the washer. Sometimes it can be really difficult to tell which way it goes, but once the grommet's been pressed, it's usually pretty easy to see. Then I'll grip the grommet together with one hand and use the thumb of my other to push it off. So now my grommet has stayed sandwiched together. And now I'll place it on my grommet press. I actually have a grommet press that I purchased on eBay that I use to set the grommets. But if you don't have one, that's totally fine. They sell a lot of grommet setters that you can simply use with a hammer. But I do so many grommets that this was a pretty good investment. So here's my grommet press. And I'm going to take my grommet, so you can see here, and place it right side down in the little groove there. It does take some good leverage. And now my grommet is set. I'm going to repeat that process for all the grommets in my corset. For the final step of the corset, we're going to add the binding. Before I do so, I want to check to make sure all of the edges are neat and straight. So you can see right down here at the bottom, I have some of the seam allowances sticking out here. I'm going to go ahead and trim those off and make sure everything is smooth. This is also a good time to try on your corset to see if it needs any adjustment. It's difficult to make adjustments in width at this point since you've finished so much of the construction. But if you need to make adjustments for length, those can still be pretty easily done. Now I'm going to add binding on the bottom edge of my corset. I like to start with this one because it already has the stitches on the bottom. So if I need to, I can push the boning up a little and out of my way while I sew on this edge. It's also not quite as noticeable as the top, and so it's a good one to practice on. So I'm going to go ahead and flip my corset upside down so that I am looking at the bottom edge. For my binding, I made a bias strip from the same fabric as my corset. You can also buy pre-packaged bias tape if you prefer. My bias strip here is 1 1/8 inch wide. I'm going to start by squaring off the end. And then I'm going to place the binding right side down on the corset, and I'm going to align the raw edge of the binding with the top edge of the corset, but I'm going to let it extend over about 3/4 of an inch. So I'm letting it hang off a bit. And then I'm going to take this end and fold it over so that it comes around the back edge. And I'm going to clip that in place. I'm also going to ensure that all of the boning pieces are out of the path of my seam allowance. And I'm going to align the binding with the bottom edge of the corset. You can pin or clip this in place all the way down, but I find that I like to align it as I sew. So I'm going to head to the sewing machine and I'm going to line up this edge very carefully as I sew. So I'm going to stop and adjust quite a bit as I go along. When I get to the end, I'm going to do the same thing that I did in the beginning. So when I get to the end, I'm going to stop about 1 inch or 2 away from the edge. I'm going to trim off my binding and fold it back under. And then I'm going to continue to sew off. That will let the end of the binding have a nice finish. I'm going to be sewing the binding to the corset with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And again, as you sew, make sure all of the boning is pushed out of the way. I would recommend wearing protective eyewear just in case one of those bones does slide into the path of your seam allowance. The bottom binding is attached, and now I'm going to do the same thing to the top. I'm going to take the time to push all of these bones down as far as they will go into the channel. I want to make sure that they are not in my seam allowance. Once that's done, I'm going to repeat the exact same binding process on the top edge. The binding is attached to both edges of my corset, and now I'm ready to finish it off. To do this, I like to flip my corset over. The first thing I like to do is flip my binding up so that it's extending beyond the edge of the fabric. And now I'm going to press. If you're using binding that has already been pre-pressed or pre-folded, you may not need to do this step. Since my binding was a flat strip, I'm going to press it now, going up this way away from the main body of the corset just to help it lay a little nicer. Make sure that the binding is fully extended. I like to pull just slightly to make sure it isn't folded under at all. And I'm going to do this across the entire edge on both the top and the bottom. It may be helpful to use a pressing hand for this step. The first thing I'm going to do is eliminate some of the bulk in this corner. I'm going to grab my scissors and trim at an angle. Now, I'm going to fold the corner back, fold the edge down 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch, and then fold the edge over and clip in place. I like the folded edge of my binding to hit this row of stitches or go just a smidge beyond. Once I have this folded all the way across, I'm going to stitch it in place by hand. With the binding, I do like to fold it all into position first. It's tempting just to start sewing and fold as you go, but I find sometimes the bias binding stretches and then you end up with a few wrinkles in your fabric. So I've had more success making sure it's all in position first. If you find that your binding is just slightly too small, it's fine if the stitching is visible. You can also fold the edge just a little smaller, or you can trim off the bottom or top edge of the corset. When I do this, I don't like to trim very much. Usually I start with like a 1/16 of an inch and see if that's big enough. So if you want to make sure you have a little extra room on your binding, I would cut the strips 1 1/4 inches wide. So I'm going to continue to fold this in place. Again, I'm just going to do a little fold on the edge and then fold it over to meet my line. This is one of the reasons I like using a flat strip of binding instead of one that is pre-pressed, just because I can control the placement of that fold as I need. Sometimes different fabrics have different thicknesses and may require just a slightly different size. By leaving the binding flat to begin with, it allows you to adjust that as needed. However, I would not make the folded edge any smaller than 1/8 of an inch because you don't want the fabric to fray. If you don't want to have to sew your binding in place by hand, you can do so by machine. If you plan to do this, I like to cut the binding just a little bit wider, and then when you fold over the edge, let it fall just a little bit below the line. And then, to sew the binding in place, stitch in the ditch from the front side of the corset. The reason I usually prefer to sew by hand is sometimes when you sew from the front of the corset, you miss the edge of the binding that's on the other side, and then often have to sew small sections by hand anyway. So I find it just gives a better final appearance to sew it by hand. So turn on your favorite movie and sit back, relax, and enjoy a little hand sewing. When I get to the end, I'm once again going to trim off the bulk, so I'm going to cut a little corner off here, fold the edge back, fold down, and fold down. I'm going to sew the binding in place with just a single strand of thread, and I'm only going to stitch through the canvas layer. So I'm going to sew the edge of the binding to the canvas. I don't want any of the stitches to show through on the front of my fabric. To start, I'm going to come in through the side to hide my thread tail. So I'm just going to lift this up real quick. Do a couple tiny back stitches. And once I'm sure my thread's secure, then I'm going to begin sewing. And I'll trim off this tail in just a bit. I'm going to sew together with just a very small whip stitch. So I've just done a stitch through a strand of the canvas and through a little edge of the binding. And I'm going to continue to do that. I'm going through a little strand of the canvas and the edge of the binding. And I can trim off this thread tail now. And I'm going to check the position of the binding as I go and adjust as needed. Don't just assume that it's going to stay in place as you go along, because it does tend to shift a bit. If you don't want to use a whip stitch for this step, you can also use a slip stitch, and that works just fine. But I've found that as long as the whip stitches are kept small, they're almost as invisible. Do be sure to use a coordinating thread. You can see what a nice finish the whip stitch gives your project, with no visible stitching on the front. So I'm going to keep going until it's time to change my thread, and then I'll come back and show you how I do that. I'm running out of thread on my needle and I'm ready to change the thread. To do this, I roll up the edge of the binding just slightly. And then about in the position where I would do my next stitch, but in the seam allowance, I'll do a couple of back stitches. I usually like to do this 2 or 3 times until that thread feels secure. And then I'll place my needle inside and out through the edge of the binding and pull it up. This way I can trim off that thread with no visible knot. Now I've rethreaded my needle and I'm ready to keep going. So I'm going to roll up the binding once again, and hidden underneath I'm going to do a couple back stitches. And then from where my back stitching is to where I left off, I'll do a stitch. I'll fold the edge of the binding back down and keep going. I have my binding finished, and the last thing I have to do is lace my corset. There are lots of different things you can use to lace your corset depending on how you're going to be wearing it. I'm simply using ribbon today. I often use rattail cord. It seems to work great. You can also get corset lacing, or ice skating shoelaces work as well. I usually like about 4 yards of lacing, but that can vary based on your preference. I'm just using 3 yards today, so it's not super unwieldy while I'm filming. When I lace, I like to find the center of my lacing. So I've folded this in half so I know where the center is. And I'm going to put a little clip on it so I don't forget. And then I'm going to lace starting at the top. And I'm going to go down through the first grommet on each side. I'm going to try to pull it evenly on each side, and I want my center of my ribbon to be in the middle. As I'm lacing, I like to keep the corset open as much as possible. This will make it easier to take the corset on and off. When I insert the ribbon into all the other grommets, I'm going to always do so from the inside to outside. I just like the way it looks. And since I'm using ribbon, I'm going to take care to make sure it doesn't get twisted. And again, from inside to outside. Now I've done the first few grommets, I am at my waistline. When you do the waistline, this is actually where you're going to be adjusting your lacing when you're wearing it. So on this section, I'm simply going to go straight down to the next grommet. This will leave a little flat section here, and that's where you can adjust the lacing. And then I'm gonna keep going as before. And since I'm using a little bit shorter lacing today, I am gonna have to pull it just slightly here. And then when I get to the bottom, I'm gonna tie the two together. Normally I just use a knot for this because I'm not going to take it out. Depending on how long your lacing is, you may need to adjust that. You could see my bottom edge is a little too big here. So I'm gonna slide it back into position. I want the excess lacing to be at the waist. That way when you put the corset on, you can pull the ribbons to bring it together. And we now have our underbust corset. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. Happy sewing!